Well, we are returning now to our study of Deuteronomy, and we have come to the section that I've called the laws on the love of God. And if we look again at our diagram, our chiasm, or perhaps more helpfully, our step pyramid, we began looking at something of the history of God's dealings with Israel that Moses wants to focus on in this farewell sermon of his, Deuteronomy as a single sermon. And then we looked at the warnings in light of the history, in light of the stubbornness and disobedience of Israel. Moses has a whole section of warnings to the people. And then we come at chapter 10, verse 12, to the laws about the love of God and what God is asking of his people to demonstrate their love for him. And in the last session, we looked at the general way in which God addressed that matter of loving him and how God wanted to stress that this is a personal relationship. He wants them to fear him, to love him, to serve him, to walk with him. This is not a mechanical relationship. It's not just a matter of checking off boxes of law keeping, but it's a personal connection of God with his people. Nevertheless, there are specific laws as well as the general call to love and serve God. And as we come to Deuteronomy chapter 12, we begin to look at some of those specific laws relative to the love of God that Moses lays out in this sermon. And the first point that we see there in chapter 12, most of these points relate to the worship of God, the service of God. And the first point that Moses wants to make in chapter 12, a specific point, is we are to worship God where he appoints his worship to take place. He says there near the beginning of chapter 12 that God will choose a place for the people to worship. And that's where the people are to worship alone. We can see that in verse 5, you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go. Now, we know what that place is, don't we? It's Jerusalem. That will be the place where God will dwell. It's the place where God will have his temple built. It's the place where the king will live near the temple. And God is already saying he has all this in mind. They haven't even entered the land yet. We don't know whether they've even heard of Jerusalem yet. Maybe they have. But God has already prophesied that this will be a place. There will be a place where he will cause his name to be honored, where his worship will take place. Now, this is so obviously a reference to Jerusalem that some of the liberal scholars in earlier times said, well, you see, it has to be written after the event. How would Moses have known that there was going to be a single place? Well, this, of course, is the liberal assumption that God can't possibly know the future, that God can't prophesy. If you believe in a God who's in control of all things, then it's a very small matter for him to be able to prophesy the future. And that's what we're seeing here. What we see really so wonderfully throughout the scriptures is how everything holds together. I was talking to R.C. some months ago, and I said, you know, one of the things that impresses me as I get old, very old, is that the more I study the Bible, the more I see the coherence of the Bible. The more I see that all of these many books written over many centuries by a number of different people, the message all coheres. It fits together. There's a truth that hangs together in the scriptures. And it's so impressive the more you read the Bible. And it's so troubling when you hear people say, oh, the Bible's full of contradictions. And then you want to say, name one. And then you want to say, how much of the Bible have you read? And you discover that people who make these observations usually don't know anything about the Bible at all. Now, that's not absolutely 100% true all the time, but by and large, that's true. And I think it's important for us as Christians to have this confidence that there's this wonderful coherence of meaning and truth and teaching in the Bible, and we see that here. God knew from the beginning that he was not going to only give his people a land, which he'd already promised to Abraham, but he was going to give them a capital city. And in that capital city, great things would happen. And so we're hearing this already, and God is teaching that. And so he wants to say here, you're to worship in that place I will choose. You're not to worship in the places that the pagans worshiped. That's a very important point, because it's always been a temptation of people to take over somebody else's temple and just worship there. I think, what's the modern expression? Repurpose. There's a great tendency to repurpose, but the danger in repurposing is that some of the old purpose lingers. And God was very adamant about that. I don't want the old purpose to linger in any way. So you're not to worship at the pagan places, because if you worship at the pagan places, the great danger is you will fall into the pagan ways. And Moses specifies the great danger there later in chapter 12 at verse 29. Moses says, when the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations whom you go in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and dwell in their land, take care that you be not ensnared to follow them after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? That I may also do the same. So it's not that they're forbidden knowledge. It's not that they can't acquire knowledge about pagan religion. You can take your pagan religion course at college. But you mustn't inquire how the pagans worshiped in order to do the same. And then verse 31, you shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. You're to worship God in his way, not in their way. For every abominable thing that the Lord hates, they have done for their gods, for they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. So here Moses takes the most extreme example of the horrors of pagan worship. And he says, this is where you end up if you're going to follow these pagans. And you have to resist that. You have to reject it utterly. You have to drive those places and those practices out of the life of your people. And this remains important for us, because this is God saying to us today just as much, I want you to worship me in my way, not in your way. I care about my worship. I care about the way in which we relate to each other. And so I don't want you to be creative in worship. God encourages creativity amongst humans in all sorts of areas of life. But he does not encourage creativity in worship. And so he makes this so plain. And that is striking, isn't it? The horror of that picture, that some people, to placate their gods, are willing to sacrifice their own children horribly. That's not just theoretical. This isn't just exaggeration. That was actually happening in the Canaanite nations. And it actually comes to have an impact on Israel. We think of Jephthah, don't we, in the book of Judges. He's influenced by pagan ways, and so is willing to vow to sacrifice his daughter if God will reward him. This is not something God asked. This is something that horrifies God. But Jephthah accommodated his thinking to pagan ways. And so this isn't a remote possibility. This is a real possibility that Moses is warning his people against. So avoid pagan places, avoid pagan ways. Seek the place where the Lord is going to lead you to worship, and there you shall worship him and rejoice. That I find intriguing here. Verse 7 of chapter 12. And there, in that place that the Lord will appoint, and there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice. I don't know if we think about that enough in terms of Old Testament worship. We maybe are familiar with the the notion of pilgrimage to Jerusalem. We think of the effort to get there. We think of the sacrifices offered. We think of the formal activities at the temple. But do we think enough that God says the very essence of this ought to be rejoicing? Again, it's not checking off boxes of having fulfilled duties. There is duty, that's important, but it's duty to a purpose. It is like us going to church on Sunday, isn't it? It is a duty to go to church, but it shouldn't culminate just in being a duty. You shouldn't arrive in church and sit down in the pew and say, okay, I'm done now. I've gotten here. I don't have to be any more involved in this. Other people are going to be active and I'm here. No, we're to be involved, and the involvement is to be rejoicing. What a great thing to be in the presence of God. What a great thing to be able to worship God. And that's already established here and repeated here, verse 12 of chapter 12. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and your daughters, your male servants and your female servants, and the Levite who is within your town, since he has no portion and inheritance with you. We'll come back to talk about that. Verse 18, the same point is made. But you shall eat them before the Lord your God in the place that the Lord your God will choose, you and your son and your daughter and your male servant and your female servant and the Levite who is within your towns. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God in all that you undertake. So here is this repeated, as I say, there's a lot of repetition in Deuteronomy, and it's to help us really get the point that rejoicing is at the very heart of God meeting with his people. And then the Lord, to underscore all of this, in verse 8 of chapter 12 says, and you shall not do according to all that we are doing here today. Now that's kind of interesting. We're doing something today, you're not to do that anymore in the future. Well, what does that mean? Everyone doing what is right in his own eyes. And what the Lord is really saying is, right now, it's kind of ad hoc. Right now, we're doing the best we can do because we don't have that central place yet to worship. And so we're doing what seems right to us, but that's not to go on forever. The day's coming when that will change, and you will be doing what's right in my eyes, in my place. So keep that in mind, get ready. And of course, what we find in Judges, what's the repeated refrain in the book of Judges? The people did what was right in their own eyes because there was no king in Israel. So the coming of the capital, the coming of the kingship, the coming of the temple, the coming of the single focal place of worship, all of that is future and to come and to be looked forward to as fulfillment. Now you can say perhaps that Israel may at times have wondered if this fulfillment is a good thing. Because when the day of fulfillment comes, it's going to be difficult, isn't it, to go to Jerusalem to worship when you used to be able to worship down the street. Jerusalem, for some people, for many people, will be a long way away. Israel will be largely an agricultural community. The population will be spread out, and there will be an obligation to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year to worship God. They didn't have private jets to get to Jerusalem. They didn't have cars to get to Jerusalem. Even though Israel is a relatively small land, if your means of transportation is walking, you have a long way to go. And it's disruptive. It's going to be days away from home, away from your work, and it's going to be very tempting to say, well, Lord, it's really not convenient for me to do that. And so the Lord is building into the life of his people structures that are constantly going to be saying to them, are you serving me? Are you serving me in my way? Are you going to structure your life around me? This, I think, is an important relationship to our belief in a Christian Sabbath on Sunday. Because if Sunday is a Christian Sabbath, it's going to really influence how we structure our week and our time and what we do and how we think about it. If worshiping God on Sunday is an obligation, not just a occasional opportunity, it's going to influence the way we plan our whole lives. It'll influence maybe the jobs we take. And God is structuring life so that his people are constantly having to think about him and keep him central in the lives that they live. And that's what we're finding here in a remarkable way. And so this chapter talks a little bit about the sacrifices that will be offered. It's interesting, in the book of Deuteronomy, there's not a lot of specification about sacrifices. That's really covered in the book of Leviticus. And so there's reference to sacrifices, but not a lot of specificity about sacrifices. But what is specific here in Deuteronomy is the reminder that the sacrifices, the tithes given to the Lord, are given to support the tribe of Levi. You remember, all the tribes are given a part of the land when they take the promised land, but Levi has no land. So Levi cannot support itself. But Levi has been given a special job. The people of Levi are to support the temple, support worship, and part of the tribe of Levi will be the priests in the temple. But even the Levites who are not priests are functionaries in the temple and in the service of God. And so they have to be supported in that. And that's what the tithe went for in Israel, to support the temple system, and to support the members of the tribe of Levi in their work before the Lord. And here too, you see the Lord emphasizing the connectedness of the people, how the people are to care for one another, how their hearts are to go out to the brethren, how they're not just to greedily keep all that they have for themselves, but that they are to be sure that the whole people are cared for. And so part of the bringing of the tithes and the offering of sacrifices is so that Levi will be fed. And all of this, can so easily seem distant from us, but all of it, as we try to look at it, has a very great purpose in establishing the community of Israel and the connectedness of the people. And then here we find one of the characteristic statements about the sacrifices, that they may eat the meat sacrificed, but they may not eat the blood. And the reason for that is given here. Verse 16 and verse 23 of chapter 12. Only you shall not eat the blood, you shall pour it out on the earth like water. And down at verse 23, only be sure that you do not eat the blood, for the blood is the life, and you shall not eat the life with the flesh. It's not that blood was inherently unclean, but blood, they understood, was life to an animal. They didn't know all about the circulatory system. They didn't know all that blood did chemically in the body, but they did know that if you got a bad cut and you bled, you would die. Somehow life was dependent on the blood. And what this regulation is saying is, we don't eat living animals. We don't eat living beings. And we treasure life. We see life as a gift from God, and therefore we don't eat the blood as a recognition that life has come from God, and we want to honor that. We want to recognize God as the giver of life in not eating the blood. So that is sometimes raised as a question today. Can Christians eat blood? And I've just always felt that the sensible answer to that is, why would you? I'm not sure it's forbidden. It just seems yucky. But I'm not sure that's a theological category. And maybe if you're Scottish and eat blood pudding, or black pudding, or you're Hungarian and eat blood sausage, I'm not sure that's a violation of the law of God. But it is a reminder that we're to be thoughtful about all these things and careful in the way that we live. And you'll be surprised to learn that that's here too, the call to being careful, verse 28. Be careful to obey all these words that I command you, that it may go well with you and that your children after you forever, when you do what is good and right in the sight of the Lord. That carefulness is really crucial. And the reason he's giving all these rules about worshiping in the place and in the right manner that God will establish is, this will be critical to establishing the unity of the people of God. By having to go to Jerusalem, by having a single altar in the land, they will have a sense of connectedness to one another. If they were all just worshiping out on their farms, spread out, it would be very easy to lose all sense of connectedness, all sense of belonging to one another. But having an obligation 3 times a year to go to Jerusalem is going to say to the people of God, we really belong together. Here we all are together. We are united here with our God in this place. And it's interesting, isn't it, that Jesus brings that up in John chapter 4 when he meets the Samaritan woman. He's talking to the Samaritan woman, and all of a sudden she asks about worship. Now, lots of interpreters have said she's just asking a theological question to avoid facing her moral situation. I don't think that's true. I don't think theological questions are a diversion. And I think it's interesting, Jesus didn't treat her question as a diversion. He took it very seriously. Jesus was very good in conversation. If he didn't like where you were taking the conversation, he didn't let the conversation go there. He controlled conversations. And he takes her question very seriously. She's a Samaritan. She says, you Jews think we have to worship in Jerusalem, but we Samaritans worship on the mountain. Who's right? And what does Jesus say? He doesn't say, you're just avoiding moral issues, which are more important than theological issues. No, he gets back to the moral issue eventually, but he says, that's a very important question. And what does he say? He says, the Jews are right. The Samaritans are wrong. You've been wrong not to worship in Jerusalem. That's the place God appointed. That's the place where you're supposed to worship. But, he says, that's all about to change. The earthly Jerusalem was temporary. And the days are coming when the God who seeks worshipers, isn't that an amazing phrase in John 4? God seeks worshipers. We're accustomed to think that he seeks sinners, he seeks the lost, he seeks people to believe. But he's also seeking worshipers. That's the end. We can almost say salvation isn't the end, worship is the end. Once we're saved, we worship. And so Jesus is saying God is seeking worshipers so that those who worship him will worship him in spirit and in truth. Those will be the defining characteristics of New Testament worship. It's a people who worship in the power and life of the Spirit and worship according to truth. And in a profound sense, the whole character of Jerusalem is preparatory for that, to help us think about the central place that unites us as a place of worship. And where do we as Christians worship? This is a trick question. We as Christians all worship in the same place. Together. We worship together in the heavenly Jerusalem. That's what Hebrews 12 is telling us. When we gather in our different churches, by faith, we are really entering the heavenly Jerusalem. And we join the myriads there in glory. We don't see it yet. We worship by faith and not by sight right now, but we're still kind of fulfilling what we're reading about here. The earthly Jerusalem was always a shadow of the heavenly Jerusalem. The earthly temple was always a shadow and copy of the heavenly temple. And the great privilege that is ours is we no longer worship in the shadows and copies, but we worship in the reality in heaven. And one day we'll see that reality coming down from heaven in the new heaven and the new earth. And all of this helps us to understand that and to rejoice in that so that we too are people rejoicing in worship. So as we conclude, we're intrigued to see how Moses is talking about a place that we know better than Moses ever knew, and we know even better than that place now. We know the reality, not just the copy. So these are wonderful encouragements, I think, to us in our Christian life.